I'm so excited to be here today for DevX Conf. Today I want to talk to you about why I don't think DevX is really about making it easy. To give you an idea of why I'm talking about this, you only really need to know one thing about me. And it's that I spent the last several years of my life working on a programming language called Dark. Dark itself was a language that was coupled to its editor and its infrastructure. But the more important thing is when you spend all your time working on a programming language, you start to think a little bit differently about the tool you're building, about the tools you're using to build that tool, and really about every other developer tool you've ever worked with. And one of the things that I found really interesting as I started to dig into all developer tools, I looked at over 100 of them. And it turns out there's really only a few words we use when we're talking about them. Almost every single tool tells you it will make it easier, it will make it faster, it will make it automatic, it will make it simple. I looked at things from application makers to infrastructure to small things that were mostly about developer workflow. Across the board, the theme that keeps coming up is we want it to be easy. And this makes a fair amount of sense. So Stripe released the Developer Coefficient Report in 2018. And in it, they posited that developers are wasting a lot of time because our tooling isn't great. In fact, that we're wasting $300 billion worth of time because our tooling isn't great and we have to work inefficiently. And so when you think about that in context, it kind of makes sense that we'd want it to be easier. I don't think anyone wants to be wasting that much time or effort. But then I stopped to think about it from a developer's perspective to say all right, if we want it to be easy and we have hundreds of tools that are trying to make it easy, why hasn't it really gotten easier since the beginning of my career? We're able to build more things now, but I wouldn't say I spend much less time than I did. So I want you to stop and think for a minute about the last time you really enjoyed writing software. I'm not saying that everyone has to say this is my one and only passion, I live for code, I write code all weekend, no. This is just, we do this possibly at our job for 40 hours a week, or we at least like writing software enough that we've come to a conference about developer experience. So think about what it is that you like about software, the magic moments that feel really good to you. I'll give you one of mine. When I was working on Dark, we got to the point where a lot of people wanted to connect to other external infrastructure as well. And I spent a bunch of time figuring out how to connect Dark to GCP's asset storage, the equivalent of S3, but in GCP. And I did a bunch of talks and I wrote all the sample documentation and I wrote a bunch of code live to show people how to do it. And it was great, but it wasn't great because it was easy. It was kind of the opposite of easy, actually. It was great because I felt like this. I was typing, I was going. When I found a problem, I could solve it. It was great. And I hope that a lot of you have felt this feeling too and that you remember the time you were writing the thing and it was hard, but it worked out really well. Programmers and developers aren't the only people who feel this. There's a psychologist, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who says, the best moments in our lives usually occur if a person's body or mind is stretched to its limits in a voluntary effort to accomplish something difficult and worthwhile. Or if I'm going to kind of condense this, we like to do hard things that we're good at. There's something rewarding about the experience of doing something hard that not everyone can do that we're able to do. And the research actually goes into a visual diagram of this to explain what the opposite things besides the enjoyment of doing things we are good at are. This particular graphic is from Jesse Schell's The Art of Game Design. People talk about this a lot with building video games and board games. And it's the idea that you want the level of skill you have to match the amount of challenge you are facing. And that magical feeling comes when those two things are matched and you are in a state of flow. So you want to think about the bottom of the chart, what being bored feels like. If you've ever had that experience where you're going to have to do some manual task, like copy paste a lot of email addresses into a spreadsheet or basically anything that's manual labor like that, and you go, oh, okay, instead of doing this tedious labor for the next 2 hours, I'm just going to write a script, and then it takes way longer than it would have done to just do whatever the manual task was, but you felt a lot better about it because you weren't bored while doing it. That's how much developers like to be in flow. We really want to avoid boredom. And then on the top side of this chart, everything about what anxiety feels like when you're developing. If you've ever ended up with, you have no idea why it's working, you are ready to bang your head against your desk, you are so frustrated because you can't figure it out and you have no idea what the next step is, that's when it's too hard and you're facing the anxiety and you're not in flow. So this is what we want it to be like. We want it to be hard, but we also want to be able to be like Elle Woods in Legally Blonde and say, what, like it's hard? I just did it. I worked through it. Sure, it took me a while, but I got there. So what I want to do with the rest of our time is talk about how we can consider a developer experience if we're really optimizing for flow rather than easiness. So the first half of this, I think a lot of times when we think about developer experience, we think about getting started. We think about onboarding and new users and people who want to try our tool. And I think that's a great place to start. While we were building Dark, I got to spend a ton of time pairing with other people who wanted to build something using the language. And over time, I noticed that there are 3 primary learning styles for developers. This is different. You might have heard about learning style theory before, the idea that some people like to learn verbally, some people like to learn kinesthetically through movement, some people like to learn by building things. This is a little bit different. What I found specifically for developers was that there were 3 primary archetypes of people, how people would approach learning something new. There was a set of people who just wanted to read all of the documentation and load the entire system into their head. There was also a set of people who wanted to go into the experience and they had a stock project they put onto every blank canvas. It might have been a Fibonacci, it might have been a Project Euler problem, it might have been a dummy app that they were really confident making, but they wanted to make something from scratch. And then the third set of people wanted to see a finished application and be able to take it apart and go from there in order to learn how to build their own thing. Now, this is important because most of us default to one of these 3 styles. I'm more of the third one. And if you approach a tool and it only focuses on one of these and it's not yours, you're in for a lot of pain. You'll end up in a situation where the level of challenge is exceptionally high relative to what you know, because you're not just trying to learn something new. You're trying to learn something new by learning in a new way. And so for all of us who are out there building tools and trying to make developer experience better, we need to keep in mind that the way we think about learning something new isn't necessarily the way every developer is. And if we're only going to have one type of onboarding, we should keep in mind it's probably only going to work for a subset of people who might otherwise benefit from using our tool. Now, that's only one type of too hard. What about if we want to remediate that something's slightly too hard? The experience of something being slightly too hard will probably show up if you see a lot of people getting excited, talking about the project on the Hacker News, starring the project on GitHub, but then not actually using it for something, or you see a lot of excitement, but it doesn't translate into much usage. So there's a few things we can do to make too hard better. The first one is to anchor on a familiar onboarding. So if people are accustomed to learning new things by doing something from the CLI, that's great. Having a CLI will make them feel a lot more at home right away because they're starting with something they know. Similarly, it can be connecting to an existing skill. So it's going to be a lot more comfortable to pick up a new tool if someone says, oh, here's the best way to use this tool coming from JavaScript, if you have years of experience with JavaScript, or any other language for that matter. But giving people an existing skill to anchor to is also really helpful. And then the third one that I think is quite similar is the idea that you can connect to an existing workflow. Perhaps it's adjacent to 2 other steps in a tool chain and it works in a similar way. That's something that's going to help someone get in their head, oh, this is how I fit this in with everything else I'm doing, and that ends them feeling a lot more comfortable. One caveat that I want to have here that I think people often miss is that sometimes having more expertise going into a new tool actually makes things harder. So if you have learned a very specific mental model of the world and you are shifting tools, you might have to unlearn something that you already know. A really interesting example of this is Dark was functional. And so I spent a lot of time working with a whole bunch of different developers on some of the key concepts. And over time, I found that if people knew another functional language, that was the best. They picked things up the most quickly. If people hadn't actually spent that much time programming, so think like data scientists or PMs who were fairly technical but didn't write code all day as developers, they did fine. They didn't really think functional languages were weird because they didn't have a point of comparison. The people who had the hardest time were people who had really internalized imperative models because they were having to undo a bunch of stuff they were assuming about what Dark would be like and then figure it out. And that's not just true about functional versus imperative languages. It can be true about a whole bunch of things. So the more expertise someone has, it might actually make it harder for them to learn a new tool, even though you would expect them to thrive. Now, the reason we were originally here. What about the opposite experience? Remediating when it is too easy. And so what too easy looks like is people try something out and they go, okay. And then it doesn't really seem to matter to them. It may be cool, but not useful. The most painful example of this I encountered was, of course, with Dark, where what we had was you had the ability to set up a data store that you could use within your backend web application. It was either one command or you clicked on one button. We can get into keyboard, mouse things in the Discord later if people want to. And it just made a data store, and then you could write out your schema and you could use it. This did not work for people. A large chunk of the time, people would click the button and go, that's not a data store. And I would say, yes, it is. It says so right there. You can see the icon. It says DB on it. You can see where you put the schema in. You can put objects in. You can take them back out. And people just really didn't think it was possible that they had made a data store that quickly. And it was extreme cognitive dissonance. And so I would spend more time trying to convince them it was a data store than I would have spent if it had simply been a little bit harder to make one to begin with. And so to show you what that experience looks like, I'm going to show you another application that I think did that really well. But to contextualize, you might remember Kayak from kind of the earlier 2000s. When you were searching to book a flight in Kayak, the little meter at the top, the flippy, it was like a train carousel, old mechanical sign, would flip to claim it was searching each airline individually. If you've ever worked in travel, you know this is like not how Amadeus or Sabre or any travel backend actually works, but it gave customers the feeling that Kayak was doing all of the work they had been doing by manually checking each airline. And so you can do a similar thing with one-click databases. So there's this app, Railway app, who's done basically the same thing. You can see this here. When you provision your data store, they do this thing where it waits for a while and then it sets up. And so what I like about this, I'll let it loop a few times so you can see it, is that it takes long enough that you feel like it's a real data store, and then it lands you in the types of things that mediate the experience being too hard. So it keeps it from being too easy, and then it keeps it from being too hard by providing the next set of steps for what you should do, connecting to your CLI, and looking at where your project lives. So the remediations for when something is too easy, you need to make it feel believably hard. You need to make it feel like whatever you're working on, you have actually truly accomplished something, and you need to make it enough effort that people feel like they've done something meaningful, not just like they clicked a button. None of us want the experience of developing software to just be like one copy paste. We want to feel like we're making progress by doing it. And that's what helps us bring people back up into flow when it's gotten too easy. So those are the three things I think you should consider when people are getting started. The learning style, making sure that it's not too hard, making sure it's not too easy, the Goldilocks onboarding experience. But the key thing is you have to keep going with this. This isn't like a piece of software that you use once. When we're thinking about the tooling that we're using, we learn how to use it, but then we keep using it every day for years. And many of us get to do this at work all the time. And so we want our continued experiences to keep having this feeling. So one concept I'll bring up here is the idea of progressive disclosure. It's commonly used kind of as an information architecture thing, but it's the idea that you don't want to overwhelm people by showing all of the information at once. If you show all the information at the beginning, you're going to be up in that anxiety state where it's too much to comprehend and you get overwhelmed. And plus, if you do that first, show everything up front, everyone's really anxious, and then they learn it all, and then they're really bored because there's nothing new. And so progressive disclosure is the idea that you want to keep meeting the information out over time. What I think is distinct for developers compared to any other application that's using this concept is that we have two great tools for doing this: error messages and documentation. So by having good error messages, when someone's getting stuck, you might easily get into a state of anxiety with an error message. Having a good message means you can read it, you can understand what's going on, and you can start to figure out how you're going to solve it. So that lowers the anxiety and gets you back into flow. Once you've figured out what's going on, you can use the documentation to figure out how to solve your problem and keep moving along with your new skill. Similarly, if you find yourself starting to get a little bit bored and wanting something new, maybe something gets pushed to you automatically through progressive disclosure, or maybe you go to the docs and you see what else is there and you explore, or you reach out to the community and you find out what else might be going on, and that'll also bring you back up into flow because you're able to do more complex work. And so error messages and documentation are particularly important because they're what helps us continue to grow and use the tool after that initial onboarding experience. Once you're at that place where you're consistently using and growing in a tool, there's also one more thing that I think is particularly important when we're thinking about experience, which is customization. There's a reason we all like to talk about which terminal we're using and show our editor theme and like what our custom setup is, or even the peripherals of what camera and microphone and monitor we use in our workstation. It's because we really like optimizing our craft. The joy of learning how to do something and then learning how to do it perfectly for us is something that keeps you in flow. It keeps you continuing to get better, and you end up at a point where you are a true expert over your domain. The other good thing about doing this with tools is it allows you as an individual to invest in the tool and get something back. And so you have this virtuous cycle of you're learning more, but you're putting back into the ecosystem, or at least into your own work. And so the ability to customize and continue to be an expert, even after you've been using something for a long time, is really what keeps us in this high end of flow. So I hope by now I've convinced you that good developer experience isn't about easy. Easy is the thing that appeals to people when they're realizing we want to save a lot of time and money globally, but easy isn't that experience you have that is indescribable when you've lost track of time and you are building something that matters to you. A good developer experience really means thinking about people's learning styles when they're getting started, making it not too hard and not too easy. Again, think of a Goldilocks if that helps. Giving people ways to learn over time through progressive disclosure, through good documentation, through good error messaging, so people can solve their own issues. And think of customization as the expert mode that keeps our developer experiences interesting, even after we've been doing this for years and years. When you're thinking about building a developer experience, we don't want magic. We want to get to be magicians. I hope you'll join me in the Discord after this to talk more about some of these concepts. If you have a different learning style that I didn't talk about, I would love to hear about that. If you want to totally disagree with me and say you wish your job was easy and you think no code is the next big thing, I would love to talk about that too. If for any reason you're watching this after you can't join in Discord, I'm at Chisa on Twitter, and I'm happy to talk more about this anytime.